Thank you for joining us for the January edition of Coffee with Coker. As always, it's a privilege to have you join us. Immediately following today's presentation, we will have a question and answer period. So please feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation in the area provided in the GoToMeeting dashboard. The participant phone line will be muted for today's presentation, and the materials will be emailed to you tomorrow. As you exit the webinar, a brief survey will pop up, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback on this presentation as well as suggestions for future topics. Justin Shamley, Senior Vice President, and John Morris, Manager at Coker Group, will be leading today's presentation. Please join me in welcoming Justin and John.
Thanks, Savannah. It's great to be with everybody on this Thursday afternoon. Hope it's at least reasonably warm where you are. We're having unseasonably warm weather here in Atlanta, so it's been very nice. But just appreciate the time that you all are dedicating to spend with us today on a topic that I think is quite relevant, something that I know we grapple with each and every day as we work with clients, and I would suspect that you all do as well, and that is sort of how physician compensation really is manifesting itself in this value-based era. And what we really want to do today is come away with some practical insights and tips as it relates to what we are seeing in the market, some of the industry items that are affecting compensation and value-based reimbursement, and really the challenges and opportunities that exist, as well as I said, some practical applications. As Savannah said, my name is Justin Shambley, and I'm a Senior Vice President at Coker. I spend probably 90% of my time working with health systems, private physician practices on physician compensation-related matters. About half of that time is spent really working on compensation strategy type initiatives, whereas the other half is spent more so working on compensation valuation initiatives. So we really live and breathe physician compensation, work across the country, and really enjoy getting to see how some of the changes from a healthcare reform standpoint are affecting physician compensation and working with clients to navigate those dynamics. So what we want to do today, as I said, is quickly look at the market and what's going on with the market, look at some of the challenges and opportunities that exist relative to modifying physician compensation plans, because as we will point out, the challenges are quite numerous, and that doesn't mean they can't be overcome, but I think a lot of thought has to go into how we go about that. And then we really want to provide some insights as to how we see clients navigating this paradigm change, and really even getting into some of the minutiae and just pointing out things that we would recommend you look out for. So with that in mind, I'm going to kick it over to John Morris here in a moment to provide an industry overview, and then I will come back and talk about the challenges and opportunities, practical applications, and then let John touch on some of the case studies that we'll look at very briefly. And at that, hopefully, we'll have some time to discuss any questions that the audience may have, which Savannah will tee that up as we go along. So with that, John, let me turn it over to you and let you walk us through some of the industry dynamics that are really affecting some of the discussions and conversations surrounding physician compensation.
Great. Thank you, Justin. And so you can go ahead and move to the next slide, and we'll get right into it. The traditional healthcare delivery model just continues to change. So where we used to have fragmented care management treating primarily sick people, we're moving into integrated care management, focusing on preventing that sickness. We had episodes of care, utilization management, and now moving into coordinated delivery care, finding the right services at the right time. Payments were predominantly production-based, fee-for-service. Now we're moving to fee-for-value, quality cost control, capitation in some markets. The independence of our provider base has now become mostly collaborative. And you're seeing that in ACOs, CINs, and PCMHs. Next slide. So what is the impact of this change, this consolidation, the alignment versus integration concept? Are they the same thing? We think they're slightly different. We view alignment kind of as the first step in this process and integration as the next step, which could, as you'll see in the next slide, take another 5 years. So over the last 5 to 7 years, our clients have been consolidating. They've been creating a critical mass of employed physicians and gaining market share as a result. In the next 5 years, we see the next step, integration. It's going to be gaining efficiencies, reducing costs, collaborating, sharing the best practices, and improving quality, trying to achieve the best outcomes for the lowest cost, and figuring out how and what to do with this mass that they've built of employed physicians. So on the next slide, we'll talk about alignment versus integration and why it's important. We have all these new market forces changing how reimbursement is coming into our organizations. MACRA is the largest one at hand. MIPS, APMs are going to be a part of that. Shared savings, bundled payments, patient-centered medical homes, value-based incentives, and capitation. All of these have something in common. They're going to affect how we get paid for physician services going forward. And those market forces, in turn, kind of dictate how we should be designing compensation models. And as you'll see, I mean, alignment and consolidation alone is really not going to be enough to drive success in this environment. We need to start focusing on how we can start finding value in these other areas. So in the next slide, we can talk about these changing payment models and what the overarching theme is. Starting from fee-for-service and moving all the way down to global payments, a lot of our clients are kind of hovering somewhere in the middle of these arrangements. And the overarching theme here is that there's a shift from volume to value, and the provider is seeing increasing risk for that reimbursement. The next slide will talk about the impact of these changing payment models. Two key impacts are operational and financial. The operational impacts have mostly been requiring changes to how we're currently practicing, and we're seeing a large majority of this change happening in IT, especially. The infrastructure, the corresponding staff necessary to keep up with electronic medical records. And this presents a lot of challenges too in the compensation world. When you start trying to develop compensation models for quality, you have to make sure that you can measure and report all of this stuff first. The financial component of this is mostly at risk versus guaranteed. So changes in the amount that you're receiving for the same things you did before. If you have compensation models that are incentivizing one thing but you're being reimbursed for a different thing, you know, it can cause misalignment and issues as far as what types of financial risks you can see or changes in your budgeting. So in the next slide, we'll talk about historical compensation plans. Historically, these compensation plans are driven by a sweeping consolidation trend, often, you know, high guarantees, work RVU productivity models, all mostly focused on production, not much emphasis on value-based elements. And now that we're getting into this value-based era, it requires a review, a rethinking of what compensation models should look like going forward and what's needed in the future. And changing that structure is only one facet of this movement to the value-based world. The next slide illustrates very simply what we view as the pre-MACRA and the post-MACRA world. So you can see in the top we have work RVUs multiplied by your rate per work RVU, and that equals compensation. What we view compensation being now is work RVUs multiplied by your rate per work RVU equaling your compensation. But that rate per work RVU bucket is split up into a couple different categories, such as quality, advancing care information, clinical practice improvement activities, or resource use. And I think what we want to emphasize is that the value we provide is going to be determined, the value we provide will determine how much we get paid for our volume. So it's not necessarily a complete shift, it's just a shift in how much we generate will end up in reimbursement from the value we provide. So on the next slide we can talk about these industry overview and takeaways. The physician market's changed, and now that we have built this critical mass of employed physicians in these health systems, it's led to other changes in the market. With the reimbursement paradigm changing and this greater focus on value, and it doesn't mean volume is going away, but it's just going to be balanced with other incentives like we discussed on the last slide. So with the number of physicians currently employed affiliated, coupled with the changing reimbursement market, there's a substantial focus on developing the right compensation model. And what Justin's going to talk about is how we do that. He's going to talk about how we balance all of these different challenges and look at some of the opportunities we can find with these changes that are coming down the line. So with that, I'll turn it over to Justin.
Yeah, thanks, John. And just to go back and reiterate a couple of the things that John noted that I think are of utmost importance. One being this slide relative to the illustration of changing payment models. One of the things that I like to emphasize is this slide, while we have it set up to illustrate the compensation paradigm, it in essence illustrates the reimbursement paradigm under MACRA as well, meaning right now with respect to Medicare, reimbursement is simply paid based on what physicians do, wherein going forward, there is still a heavy volume component in terms of how much a physician does impacting the reimbursement opportunity. But that reimbursement opportunity is really balanced by how well they do that work. And therefore, what I like to emphasize as we talk about MACRA is that MACRA is not necessarily a shift away from volume-based reimbursement. Volume is still a very key component relative to MACRA. What it does, though, is shift the paradigm to where volume is no longer the only focal point with respect to reimbursement. Now it's volume coupled with, as John said, how well we do that work, meaning the value we provide alongside the volume we provide. Therefore, physicians could do a lot, but if it's at a very low level of quality, the reimbursement will suffer from that. And that's really one of the key tenets that we try to emphasize as we work with health systems in developing new compensation strategies is it's not that we have to throw volume out the window immediately, because in many markets, volume is still a very, very key part of the reimbursement methodology and will be likely for the foreseeable future. But what is changing is that volume is being augmented or supplemented with these quality-based metrics that ultimately affect how much you get paid. And therefore, we think that same principle or premise should apply with respect to physician compensation models. And that's really what we'll emphasize here in a moment. The other thing I just want to emphasize again is this whole idea of alignment versus integration. And as John articulated, we've seen so much alignment occur over the last 5 to 10 years, but integration is still very much a work in progress. We've seen many health systems and their employed physician groups be able to function okay under an aligned model. That means we've developed the critical mass, but we really haven't come in and made it one cohesive group of doctors working alongside the health system. And what we really are seeing is as we move down this volume-based realm, an aligned model can't function very well. We have to be integrated, and we have to be focused on the common goal. We have to have the technology platforms that tie us together. And as a physician group, as well as a physician group working alongside the hospital, we have to be working hand in hand to achieve the initiatives that we set out ahead of us. And so that's really going to take us into the compensation model revisions and looking at challenges and opportunities. Challenges being the first focal point. And as I mentioned at the onset, I mean, the challenges are numerous. And what I really want to do is take these 5 or 6 key items that we have listed here and walk through and highlight where we see the challenges existing in the current market. Data capture being one of them. Any model, any compensation model that we put into place is going to require data unless we simply are providing a guaranteed base level of compensation and nothing else. And that is very, very rarely the case. And so we always will need data, whether it's work RVU data to capture the volume-based piece of the compensation arrangement, or other data to capture more of the soft components of the compensation arrangement. And most health systems, medical practices have gotten very good at capturing the volume-based data. But where we still see a significant challenge is capturing the value-based data. And it's somewhat baffling to me. I mean, the amount of money health systems have spent on electronic health record systems, putting in new systems, trying to make those systems function as successfully as possible, we still have a hard time getting good quality data to use in compensating physicians on a quality or value basis. It's almost like the data is in the systems, but we have not figured out how to mine it well yet to truly use it to change behaviors, to incentivize physicians, things akin to that. And I see this as a struggle in practically every health system that we work in. A great example, we were working with a health system not too long ago that wants to move to a more robust value-based incentive compensation model. And that's in fact what I was working with this health system to do. And in one of the compensation committees I was sitting in, they were discussing sort of the current compensation model, and it was time to reallocate or set metrics for their current quality incentive, which was worth about $8,000 per doctor. And hours were spent trying to figure out what data we could capture to use for this $8,000 incentive compensation component. And it was truly a struggle for this healthcare system to identify appropriate metrics for that $8,000 incentive. And my feedback to the health system was, you know, it's great that we want to move to a more value-based incentive compensation structure, very noble goal, but we have to keep in mind that if we're having trouble identifying metrics to tie to an $8,000 incentive, you're going to have a very hard time sitting down with a primary care physician and saying, hey, we want to tie, let's say, $25,000 or $30,000 of your compensation to value-based metrics, when we don't necessarily know what metrics we're going to be able to track and things akin to that, such that we can't really support an $8,000 incentive structure right now. So data capture truly has a huge impact on the ability to move down that value-based reimbursement paradigm, because we have to have the data to back up any incentives that we put into place. External drivers is also a key focal point. And what I mean by that is what's happening in the local reimbursement markets. Meaning, are payers coming and saying, hey, we would really like to pursue some alternative payment models? Or are payers pretty much sitting back and saying, you know, we're okay with the fee-for-service reimbursement environment? And what we find in many markets is, well, many markets vary greatly. We've done work in Vermont, which is a very, very progressive system state at a statewide level in terms of payment reform. Therefore, what happens in Vermont is very different than what happens in rural Minnesota or rural Texas. And so while there is a push to move heavily into the value-based reimbursement realm, we have to truly look at what's happening in the market and make sure that that market dynamics are creating a compelling reason to substantially alter the paradigm. And where that comes into play is if we are getting, let's say, 100% of our revenue right now from a fee-for-service basis, and we go put in place a new compensation model that is 100% performance-based, while noble, there is a misalignment with respect to incentives, and therefore we may be creating a great environment from a quality of care standpoint, but we are not aligned with the drivers of reimbursement. And so there has to be that happy balance of truly focusing on where the reimbursement market is, but starting to focus on some of these quality-based metrics. Another key challenge that we see is what I'll just call a lack of cohesive compensation philosophy. And we see this largely stemming from the alignment paradigm that we've been in, and this gets wholeheartedly into the idea of integration. I was speaking at an AHLA conference not too long ago, and I was talking about compensation governance, and I used the example of how most health systems create their employed physician network. And it's not that we wake up one day and we say, hey, we want to employ 250 physicians, and we go out and create the best compensation structure possible, and then add on day one 250 physicians onto that single compensation philosophy, and therefore from day one there's consistency. That's utopia. I can say I have not seen that occur. What we have seen occur is a health system deciding to develop an employee physician network and going out and buying a practice of 10 doctors, buying a practice of 2 doctors, recruiting another few doctors to the market, and this pattern continues for a few years, and we wake up and we've got, let's say 300 employed providers, but there may be 20 different compensation structures in place. And they may all have similar concepts, but generally they are all slightly different in structure. And that dynamic makes changing compensation models to align with the new reimbursement schemes extremely challenging, because it's not that we're just having to look at and modify a single compensation structure. We're having to look at and modify 30, however many different compensation structures exist, which just becomes a major administrative nightmare to administer. And so we see many health systems needing to move to a single cohesive compensation philosophy in order to allow them to pursue value-based initiatives within their employed physician arrangements. Another key challenge is this perceived decrease in compensation. And what I mean by that is whether implementing value-based incentives results in a add-on on top of the current work RVU-based pay, or if it's a reallocation. And if it's a reallocation, no matter how you slice and dice it and explain it, it is perceived as a decrease. Meaning if 100% of our compensation is work RVU-based right now, and we move to a 95-5 split, even though the opportunity to earn the same amount is there, because part of it is now not based on volume, it's perceived to be a decrease in pay. And this really ties into the last point, which is interpretation of market data. And as we develop new compensation structures, we have to understand what the market data that we use so frequently represents. And the market data does not, I say again, does not represent only productivity-based compensation, wherein we can create a lucrative productivity-based compensation model per benchmark data and then layer on top of it these new types of incentives. The market data is truly reflective of total cash compensation. So using an employed physician as an example, what's showing up in the survey data is whatever is reflected on that respective physician's W-2, which 9 times out of 10, if there are quality incentives paid, are going to be included on that W-2. Therefore, the market data already includes these incentives, and therefore, if we are creating a market-based compensation model, or if we have a market-based compensation model right now, we can't take these incentives and add on top of it new quality incentives. We really need to look at the current spend and decide how much of that should continue to be productivity-based versus how much we need to start apportioning to value-based incentives. And so we really have to understand what the market data shows as we are developing these models, which then fuels that perception of a decrease in pay, which in most instances it's not. It's simply a reallocation, no different than what's happening in a reimbursement environment. Going back to that slide on MACRA, it's not that reimbursement is going to be any less if our quality is the same or better than it has been in the past. It's simply not going to be guaranteed. Thus, we can apply those same principles in terms of comp plan development. And all of the above really creates the challenge with respect to provider buy-in, meaning data capture, the lack, or at least perceived lack of trust with respect to the data. Is the market really changing? Why do we need to upset the apple cart with respect to changing the compensation model if I don't feel like the reimbursement market is changing? The lack of a cohesive compensation philosophy, all of these things make it difficult to get provider buy-in, which we need to truly march down this path. So clearly the challenges are abundant, and by no means does this capture all of the challenges, but I think it provides a good snapshot as to where challenges exist. But that also leads into opportunities. And what we've worked with many health systems to demonstrate is looking at the compensation structure in terms of implementing value-based reimbursement incentives can truly be a stepping off point, meaning it can be a great fueling to move from that alignment realm to the integration realm, meaning changing the situation of having a whole host of providers that are aligned under various compensation strategies and moving those to a single physician compensation strategy that aligns well with the vision of the health system. And really, as I mentioned, shifting from all these various compensation structures to an organization-wide consistent methodology that ensures that we are truly integrated from a financial standpoint. And as the earlier slides emphasized, just simply changing the compensation structure will not make us integrated and function well in the value-based realm, but it is a key step in the right direction to move us down that pathway. And it just simply has to be backed up with the operational and technological initiatives needed to also fuel that change. There's also the opportunity to conform to changes in the market, meaning looking at where the market is right now and starting to ensure that we are consistent with the changing reimbursement structure. And if the reimbursement structure continues to change, we won't be caught off guard and behind the 8 ball trying to catch up. And then finally, it allows us to, what I would say, clean up existing models. When we work with many health systems, their current model may not necessarily be a bad platform, but with a few tweaks to clean up some things that really need to be changed, and then to start to reallocate or reintegrate the incentives to focus on more than just volume, there's a lot of opportunities there. And that's where we highlight, and I'll get to this just in a moment, re-looking at how we approach physician compensation and the variables that we use to drive physician compensation. So let's keep moving and really get into some practical applications that really, I think, drive home or specifically address some of these challenges. So top-down approach. This is one thing that we have heavily emphasized, and it goes back to that challenge regarding the interpretation of market data. Our perspective is that the compensation per work RVU ratios in market data that are so frequently used to establish physician compensation models is all in and representative of what I will call a typical physician, meaning if we use primary care as an example, at the median rate per work RVU, that is representative of what a typical primary care physician is doing. And so if we think about that, and even the survey data backs this up, that's going to include production-based pay, that's going to include quality incentives, patient satisfaction incentives, all of those things that a typical physician is receiving from a compensation standpoint, that's what's in that number. So it's not just a productivity-based number, it is an all-in number. And so the question that's incumbent upon us is how we take that and plug it into the compensation model, knowing that it's representative of the full Monty. And so how we've approached it in the past is viewing that as sort of the funding mechanism and then deciding where do we want to spend that money. And this truly varies by specialty. It varies by location, meaning how progressive the market is, where the provider or the health system is at. And so this isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, but it allows us a mechanism to allocate value amongst a series of key components that then allow us to relook at that allocation each year without having to go back and redesign the physician compensation model. So to use a very simple example, let's say we target a median rate per work RVU, and for the specialty in question, it's $50. And we decide, you know what, the market's not that dynamic right now, so let's put 90% of those dollars into the work RVU-based bucket. So we're going to take $50 times 0.9, and so the work RVU-based rate per work RVU would be $45. And then maybe we say, look, we're going to put the other 10% in a performance incentive for the individual doctor, which $50 times 10% equals $5. And so we're still going to let that be a work RVU-based incentive, but instead of those $5 being guaranteed, as it was in the old paradigm, it's now at risk, meaning we let the physician fund the incentive opportunity at $5 times how many work RVUs they produce, but only a portion of that is going to get paid out based on how they perform in the established performance incentive metrics. And so this structure, going back a few slides real quick, starts to highlight this concept, because in the past, the $50 would have been guaranteed. It would have been the pre-MACRA, whereas in the post-MACRA, the $50 is bifurcated amongst part of it being truly a pass-through based on what the physician does, but then part of it being at risk based on how well the physician does it. So the other benefit of this approach is that it's flexible from year to year. So if the reimbursement market does continue to change, in year 2, we may say, look, you know, we want to move a little bit more to the at-risk bucket. Thus, we move the work RVU-based piece down to 85%, and the group-based piece, or the performance incentive piece, to 15%. And so we can still target the $50 rate, but just the allocation of value of those $50 varies. And we find this top-down approach to be much more functional over time in this changing reimbursement environment than what I call a bottom-up approach, which is, in essence, setting the work RVU-based piece and then setting the quality or the performance piece, and then constantly having to change those variables to make sure that the ends are appropriate. Whereas in this approach, it's more so targeting the high-level economics and then deciding how we want to allocate those dollars from an incentive standpoint. So it just creates a platform that we feel is a little bit more dynamic year over year. And then, of course, the devil gets into the details with respect to each component in terms of how we build the work RVU-based piece, how we build the performance piece, and potentially any other incentives that may exist. The value-based incentives, or the performance incentives, you know, as I just highlighted, we don't view as an add-on. It's an allocation. Oftentimes, our clients develop a scorecard for those specific initiatives that, you know, is just a 100-point scorecard. Partial credit can be earned, but in essence, the various metrics are allocated value. And at the end of the year, a score is dictated, and so whatever the physician's score is, multiplied by the funding, the opportunity that's created based on the model, dictates the payout. And in terms of the scorecard, we clearly focus on things that the physicians can influence, meaning we have to create metrics that they buy into, they feel are meaningful and truly value. And there has to be a balance of value in terms of the incentives and metrics. And what I mean by that is we can't have a $50,000 incentive that is 100% tied to patient satisfaction or one basic quality metric. But at the same time, we can't have a $10,000 incentive that's tied to 20 different metrics, because the value associated with each metric is diluted such that there's really no focus. And I don't want to skip over the fact that developing these value-based incentives is quite complex. And it follows the old adage of we're going to spend 90% of our time working on 10% of the model. And that's what we truly experience right now because of the newness of these arrangements, meaning the work RVU-based piece is pretty easy. We decide on the rate, we plug it in, maybe we decide if we want it tiered or a few other metrics. But really the bulk of the time is spent identifying the quality metrics, developing the scoring mechanisms, getting physician buy-in. And so we truly see this requiring a governance process going forward, meaning having a quality committee that is coming up with the metrics in direct contact with the physician representatives, and then recommending those metrics to the compensation committee for approval. And we see most health systems needing to start small and then grow, meaning don't try to boil the ocean the first year you're at this. I mean, focus on basic metrics that you may already be focused on, meaning PQRS, or things that will be a focus with respect to MIPS or other payer-specific initiatives that you're already focused on. Start basic, and then as you get your feet wet with respect to these new metrics, then you can start to look at the complexity and the overall value add of the respective metrics. Another key thing that we see that's changing is with primary care and the focus on panel. And this isn't necessarily a wholehearted replacement of work RVU-based incentives, but we see many health systems starting to put panel in alongside work RVU-based incentives as simply an alternative or a balancing act. And the rationale associated with this is number one, that it incentivizes access, meaning if a physician closes their panel, that clearly does not bode well for them, especially if it's a small panel, in terms of compensation. And so by nature of incentivizing panel, it's focusing on finding ways to increase the panel through providing better access to care, whether that's simply being more efficient and opening up time to see more patients, evening weekend hours, hiring APPs to work alongside to enhance the panel. But it really focuses on access. And then the other thing is that it focuses on the many activities that primary care physicians are being asked to do these days that are not work RVU generating, that really boil down to population health in terms of managing a population of patients and all the referrals and the prescription refills and all the different things that require time but aren't necessarily billable. And to the extent there is any uptick in capitation in respective markets, it begins to develop that capitated mindset. And so we do see panel being included as small components of pay. And it's not that we are shifting the majority of incentive to panel, but it's simply another component that we can focus on as we make this transition. But it alone comes with challenges. One of the key challenges that we see is measuring panel. Most electronic health record systems have a place that records the primary care on record, but what we have found is most systems have not managed that record such that it's accurate. And therefore, what we oftentimes do is we calculate panel based on looking at unique patients seen within the last 18 months. But that even creates challenges because in many instances, a single provider or two providers saw a single patient. And so attribution of those patients to the respective providers is something that has to be worked out. But panel can be calculated in practically every environment and be a component of the compensation model to start to incentivize other things. one challenge that we see, and this isn't necessarily present in most markets right now, but I envision a time where we're going to find ourselves with what I would call toes in two different models. And what I mean is environments where there is a heavy incidence of capitation, but then also a heavy instance of volume-based or fee-for-service reimbursement. And I think those are going to be particularly challenging or tricky situations because how we would approach compensation in those two environments is very different. But at the same time, we don't want to put in two different compensation models for two different sets of patients because we want to treat every patient the same. And so I see a continued blend between work RVUs and panel-related data and them working alongside each other going forward. And what we've even done in some instances is create a new metric that we have defined as work equivalent value units, so WEVU. And it's in essence an internal metric that we've developed by blending market data for work RVUs and panel to come up with a alternative measure of productivity that looks at both. And we internally can decide what the weight is that we place on work RVUs and panel. So it's not a straight average, but we can sort of weight those two metrics in coming up with the WEVU differently depending on the dynamics of the market. And so once again, it's another means of taking data that exists and crafting it to be functional in this new market we find ourselves in. So for the interest of time, I'm going to skip through this illustration, but it's a pretty simple calculation of how we have played or used panel in compensation models in the past. And so what I want to do is go to slide 22 and really talk about another means that we've seen of adapting current compensation models to capture both work RVUs or volume and value and blend those two together. And one of the approaches that we've seen, especially when there are two distinct and separate incentives of quality and productivity, is to find what I would call buffering mechanisms. As an example, we let quality opportunity dictate the productivity incentive. So what I mean by that is if a physician's production isn't at a, quote, optimal level, that affects their ability to earn their full quality incentive. And I use the extreme example of ultimately we want to find a happy balance between quantity and quality. Because in many instances we can't be functional, or really in any instance we can't be functional seeing 1 or 2 patients a day but doing it at an extremely high level of quality. That just doesn't work. And so in most health systems that we work with, they've identified what I would call an optimal level of production that they expect their physicians to produce at. So it may be the median. And if a physician is producing at the median, then the quality incentive would be completely availed to that person. But if they're producing below the median, the opportunity is going to be reduced because we don't want to necessarily incentivize a physician who is not at least producing at the minimum work standard that we expect internally. And the same thing can be done on the flip side, meaning high-producing physicians may not necessarily earn the full incentive. Meaning if a physician is producing at the 90th percentile, but their quality scores are in the pits, in that instance, part of their production incentive may be sacrificed or not paid because of the low quality scores. And that's really a reflection of what's occurring in MACRA, to where, yes, a physician may be producing at a very, very high level, but if the quality is not there, that doesn't mean the reimbursement is going to be the same as it once was. And so we can emulate those same concepts in our compensation models. And I think those are some of the key tweaks that we can make that better align our compensation structures to the changing markets. And this is getting into the weeds just a little bit, but it's something that I have literally had conversations with every client that we work with as we delve into value-based incentives. And that is the question of what do we do with external performance incentives. And what I mean by external performance incentives are payments coming from third-party payers, from ACOs, things akin to that where employed providers are involved. And what I've seen in the past in working with a number of clients is these dollars started out very small. And so when they come in, it's like, oh, you know, $100 came through for Dr. A, so let's just pass that through to Dr. A. So that becomes the status quo. And then next year, the $100 becomes $1,000, and then the next year, the $1,000 becomes the $30,000. I mean, it truly grows as these value-based incentives pile up. And what we have articulated to clients is don't get in the habit of directly passing through these external incentives. Because if we're truly in a situation where we're moving from volume-based or fee-for-service reimbursement to value-based reimbursement, these new payments that we're receiving, i.e. third-party reimbursement or third-party payer incentives, ACO distributions, etc., we don't view those as simply a pass-through of physician compensation. We see those as new forms of revenue. So if we get into the habit of passing all of those dollars through directly as physician compensation, in essence, it would be the equivalent of every fee-for-service dollar we get in, deciding we're going to pass that through as compensation, which leaves little money to pay for overhead. And the whole idea is these value-based reimbursement incentives are going to begin replacing the fee-for-service incentives. It's not always going to be an add-on, even if it is today. And so what we recommend is letting those be forms of revenue that fund the incentive compensation model no different than fee-for-service dollars do. The trick is to align the incentives in the compensation model alongside the drivers of those new forms of reimbursement, which is no different than we've done up until this point in terms of using work RVU-based methodologies which align the drivers of compensation with the drivers of reimbursement. So we have to apply that same concept to the value-based side of the equation, but in our opinion, simply passing through those dollars is going to create a lot of havoc long-term, because we're going to create compensation models that aren't functional if those dollars truly replace our fee-for-service dollars. So it's a bit controversial, and what we've experienced is many clients have gotten into the habit of passing those dollars through such that they became pretty significant, and then it started creating potential compliance issues because it was not factored into the original model design. And going back to my initial comment or earlier comment, those dollars are technically included in the market data. Thus, we can't always argue that they are truly an add-on and shouldn't be factored into any compliance calculation that we're focused on. And then another thing that I'll highlight is the private practice dynamic. And one of the things that I like to laugh about is if I look at the private practice model, of all the compensation models that are out there, it probably is the most dynamic and free-flowing model that would be simplest to administer in a reimbursement paradigm that's shifting. And the rationale for that is that it accepts all forms of revenue, meaning pro fees, ACO income, third-party payer initiatives, capitation. In a private practice style model, those are all viewed as revenue. And then it's incumbent upon the practice to manage the expenses alongside those revenue drivers. And then whatever's left over equates to distributable net income. So in many respects, private practices aren't, at least their compensation models, aren't necessarily changing that much in terms of how revenue and expenses flow. What is changing in private practices is how within those practices the distributable net income works, meaning it may not now be all 100% based on fee-for-service dollars. We still need to look at the distributable net income and decide how we're going to apportion that based on what drives revenue and net income. But what I always laugh about is this model would work so well in hospital-employed environments in terms of adapting to the changing reimbursement environment that we find ourselves in. But in my experience, this model is by far the most difficult to apply and implement in hospital-employed environments because of all the different variables that come into play. And so by no means am I recommending this model be applied in hospital-employed environments, but it's more so to highlight that it is a great model. It works very well for private practices, and I think it will continue to work well as the reimbursement model changes. But if we could ever get to the point of it being functional in a hospital-employed environment, it might be great. But I think that's a very long-term perspective. I don't think that's something that we'll see in the near term. And so with that, it's about, I guess, 5 or 10 minutes till. John, why don't you just pick one of these case studies real quick and highlight that, and then maybe we'll turn it over to Savannah in time for just 1 or 2 questions, and then we can wrap it up and let everybody get back to their day. So, John?
Sure. I'm going to highlight the second case study there. So, go to 2 slides down here. I think this is a particularly interesting case study because we used a lot of what Justin just talked about in designing a top-down compensation structure to deal with a lot of structural issues that they were having, and then also preparing them for changes in reimbursement. And like we mentioned before, on the East, there's a more aggressive move toward value-based reimbursement and even capitation in Medicaid in some areas. And what I think is great about this model is that after it was implemented, things started to change even more rapidly than we expected, and it's just about adjusting the components in that model to meet the demands of the organization and the demands of the market, and it works pretty well. It can handle all the changes that are coming at it, and one thing I think that's particularly relevant about that is that even if in this scenario with a new administration coming in, we have changes that we don't foresee, if for some reason macro completely disappears, which I don't think it will, I think a compensation model like this, using this methodology, is about the best thing you can do to prepare for any type of environment as far as reimbursement goes. So, Justin, you want to turn it over to Savannah now and take some questions?
Yeah, let's see what questions we have. So, one question that appears to have come in is, what types of organizations should integrate? And I think that's getting back to some of the initial comments that we provided or noted relative to alignment versus integration. And I really think all organizations, all healthcare organizations should focus on integration and working towards becoming integrated. Clearly, I think the impetus is even more so on those who are on this value-based reimbursement path, because I think it will be extremely challenging for them to realize success if they don't move towards integration, both in terms of compensation structures as well as how they function organizationally from a physician relationship standpoint. So, good question. I was just looking here. Another question that came up, I think, relative to private practices. Do private practice or distributable net income models work well in the value-based reimbursement era? So I think that's getting to this slide. And as I said, yes, I think these models do work very well because they do accept all forms of reimbursement, meaning capitation fees can flow into these models just as easily as professional fees. The key comment that I made is, really, while this model would be great to see function in a hospital-employed space, we see that as being much more challenging, just because dealing with how expenses are allocated, dealing with the issues that oftentimes exist of physicians not having any control over their payer mix, payer contracting, things akin to that, I think really make this model challenging to to implement in a hospital employed space? Let's see, there may be one other question. What about value-based incentives for non-physician staff? I think that's a great question. I think in terms of non-physician staff, that could be either advanced practice providers, or it could be just nurses, et cetera. I mean, I think going back to the integration comments, all providers or all organizations need to be working in tandem as it relates to integration. But speaking specifically for advanced practice providers, we see many of the models that we put into place for physicians ultimately being mirrored for advanced practice providers. Yes, there's some nuances that we have to work out, but if advanced practice providers continue to be used more and more, which I think they will, we have to make sure that they're working in lockstep with their physician counterparts. Thus, the incentives have to be aligned. All right, so one last question real quick. It says, how does a practice straddle fee-for-service, and I think it says fee-for-value, as practices take on more risk? We are only 5% value now. Is there an interim step/model you can recommend? And I think that goes back to, I'm just going to slide back to this targeted comp per work RV ratio right now. What we really say is start small, meaning start with, maybe 5% at risk right now relative to value. Get your feet wet, get the processes down, get the governance approaches down in terms of setting the model variables each year in terms of the quality and incentive metrics. And then at the end of each year, you can assess where the market is changing and how you're doing with respect to managing the comp structure with 5% at risk, and decide whether we want to step that up. Meaning maybe next year we go to 15%, and if it still makes sense, maybe the following year we go to 20%. But the more that you put into the value-based bucket, the more your governance structure and just overall infrastructure is going to need to be built out to accommodate that. The physicians will absolutely expect that, because they, in my experience, are unwilling to put their income at risk if they can't get good data as it relates to how they're performing in those areas, and know that it's going to be assessed as objectively as possible. So I think that's all the questions, and it's right at 3 o'clock. So Savannah, I'll turn it back over to you and let you wrap us up. And once again, I just appreciate everybody's time today, and have a great rest of the day. So Savannah?
Thank you, Justin and John, for that presentation. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to Justin, John, or myself directly, and we will get those questions answered for you. Again, we would appreciate your feedback on this presentation through the survey as you exit the webinar, and the slides to this presentation will be emailed to you later today or tomorrow. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful day.